Welcome to the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm your host, Robin L. Owens, PhD, and this is where we dive in each week to give advice, tools, and tips for high-achieving women who have written books that make a difference for people while at work. I am a professor, and when I'm not doing that, I am speaking, writing, coaching, and teaching high-achieving women who have written books how to make a bigger difference, have more impact, and more purpose with their books. Okay, let's dive in. Before we get started with the episode, I want to ask you a question. Is your book ready to be turned into a successful online course? That's a question so many people have asked me. And so I decided to create a free resource to answer that very question. I took the time-tested process that I use for turning books into successful online courses, and I created a checklist that you can review and check off so you know the ways in which your book can be turned into a successful online course. So just head on over to createmasterfulcourses.com, createmasterfulcourses.com, and get your free checklist there. All right, now let's get to the episode. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. I'm so glad you're here and listening into the podcast. I really appreciate you. You have helped us get ranked in the top 5% of all podcasts, according to the podcast search engine Listen Notes. So I really appreciate you. And it would be helpful if you could go ahead and review the podcast, rate, and subscribe to help us to keep going. All right. Now, today, I'm talking with Dora Dome. Now, Dora is an attorney, author, trainer, and the owner of Dora Dome Law. Her company provides legal representation to California school districts in the area of student issues. Our company also develops and facilitates professional development trainings for school districts. And the thing that kind of boggles my mind, she's the author of 5 books. Yes, 5 books around the areas of student discipline. I'll list all 5 of them in the show notes, but let me tell you the title of the last one, the most recent one, Student Speech and Expression in Public Schools, a resource guide for K-12 schools. And her most recent, those last 3 books are a part of a new series called Tools for the Trade. So you can see she is committed to strengthening students' experiences through her legal background. So welcome, Dora Dome.
Thank you so much, Dr. Robin, for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
It's a joy to have you here. I'm really excited. Now, you heard me say a little bit about you. Why don't you tell us in your own words about you and or the work you do?
Sure. So as you mentioned, I'm an attorney. I've been practicing law for, believe it or not, this is my 27th year. I can't be that old, but I guess I am. And I have pretty much focused on education my entire career. And when I moved, I started in Hawaii. And when I moved to California, I got into education law more directly, working with a law firm that provided direct service to school districts. And I did that for about 9 years with a law firm. And then I went out on my own because I really felt like I wanted to have more of an impact, be more proactive. I felt like as an ed law attorney in a big firm, we put out fires. And I didn't want to just only put out fires. I wanted to prevent the fires. I wanted to, have it so that the people working with our children in our schools had the tools to do the work that they need to do. And so that's what I've dedicated the last 12 years of my career to, is really trying to build that capacity. And let's see, I'm a LA native and I am based currently out of Oakland.
Okay. All right. And I didn't say this in my intro and my bio, but since I was talking with you about this earlier, let me tell the listeners, you may remember from an episode a while ago, we had Nancy Dome, and you may hear this voice that sounds a lot like Nancy Dome. It is because it's her twin sister. So anyway, I just thought that would be interesting. So now you can go back and listen to that other episode and compare them. All right. So now you talked about practicing law and really wanted to make a difference. And so that's why you started your own practice. Tell us a little bit more about how the decision, maybe there was a defining moment for you to make that decision to move into your own practice.
Yeah, the defining moment I would say is I had been practicing about 14 years. And although I've always had an emphasis on student issues, the majority of my practice was in special education. And I got burnt out with special education specifically. It's just, I felt like I was fighting all the time and litigating. And that's not what I became an attorney to do. I really did, want to get into something that made a difference. And I felt like litigating wasn't necessarily the way in which I wanted to make a difference. And so I think it really was just, I was getting burnt out. It was taking a whole lot of my time and energy. I had adolescent children who also needed my attention. And I really, like I said, I wanted to change the focus from the putting out fires and the fighting and conflict to how can we create tools that support our clients, right? Our school district clients. And I actually ran this by my firm. And, while they thought it was a good idea, they weren't willing to put their money where their mouth was, right? They weren't really to really invest into it because from my perspective, it was a very untapped niche. Even though all the firms have some of that expertise, the attorneys really don't focus in on the student piece. It's really more the special ed piece. And so when they wouldn't really couldn't, I should say, see my vision, I just kind of decided, you know what? It's time to just try. And it's scary, right? It's like I'm leaving, a guaranteed salary. I'm leaving benefits. I'm leaving a phenomenal secretary. and that is no joke. I mean, my assistant was no joke. And we had been together. We started at about within a month of each other at the firm. So we had been together the entire 9 years. And so that honestly, that was one of the biggest considerations when I'm like, am I ready to go out on my own? Can I do this without Kathleen? And then ultimately I was like, you know what? If it doesn't work, I could always go back and get a job. Right. But I have to give it a try. And so that was really what happened.
Good
and
for
it worked
you.
out. Yeah.
Good for you. It does take courage to do that. And yes, the people in those administrative roles are very important. They are key people. So I definitely understand that. And that you did it anyway and you've been successful. Good for you. And really, it sounds like you really took the chance because you're committed to this work.
Yes.
And you mentioned when you started at the law firm, you want to practice law in a way to make a difference. When you were young, when you were a small child or a teenager, was there something in you that you ever thought that you would be pursuing law? What was on little Dora's mind?
I can't say that I actually thought about law specifically, and that really is primarily for lack of access. Like I didn't know attorneys. I didn't even really know what attorneys were, growing up. And so, but I've always had the desire to help. I remember when I was in second grade and there was a young girl in my class who was really having a hard time and struggling. And the teacher was getting super, super frustrated with her. And, I went over to the teacher and I said, can I talk to her? And she kind of just threw her hands up and was like, yeah, because if she doesn't figure it out, she was going to get in trouble. And I went over and I was able to kind of talk to her, calm her down. And, the teacher was committed to her being out of the class. And I said, can I walk her to the office? And I was able to kind of calm her down and get her to the office. And, that's always been a part of my personality. Now I have a whole other part too, but there's that part, that really wants to help people. And I don't like to see people struggling. I don't like to see people suffering. And I think particularly in schools, my experience in schools was definitely a mixed bag. And so when I thought about how can I make a difference, I just fell into the education law, but it fit, right? Mm-hmm. And I think it fit because of those experiences as a child, my own personal, but also just seeing how ill-equipped some teachers were to deal with kids that look like me, and really wanting to make a difference.
Yeah. And that's amazing. What grade were you in when you were helping that student?
Second grade.
Second grade. So actually, you've been doing this work off and on from second grade on
I have.
because there's a direct correlation. You were helping because lots of people say, I want to help people, but you were helping people a person in an educational setting, in a classroom, in a way that was effective. I mean, you helped. So that's amazing. And then it now takes its expression in this way in law.
Yes. Yes.
Was there a moment when you decided that law would be the avenue for it or?
Yeah. It's funny. So I, I grew up in a white Jewish neighborhood, and my family was the only Black family in the neighborhood. And so, like I said, there are not a lot of role models, not folks that look like me. And so I met a woman when I was 19 who was an attorney, a Black woman. And it was like, oh my God, you know, and she's smart, she's funny, she's got this great job working, as an attorney in the entertainment sector. And she became a mentor for me. And it was in kind of befriending her that I was like, I want to be an attorney. Now, mind you, I still didn't know what it meant to be an attorney. I had no clue. But that's kind of how kind of desperate I was for a role model, a path. The first person I meet, like, I'm going to do what you're doing, even though I don't know what that is. I'm going to do that, and because of my personality, where I set a goal or I say I'm going to do something, I pretty much do it. And so, this was at 19. And so I went to college. I, graduated from undergrad. I moved to Hawaii just to do something different. And then in 92 or 91, I was like, okay, I think I'm ready to try to be an attorney. Like I've been just floating, not really clear in my direction. And I'm like, I said I was going to be an attorney, so let's do that. So I applied to law school and ended up deciding to stay here in Hawaii and go to law school. And even then, after my first year, it was like, or I guess the beginning of my second year, I was like, is this really for me? And partially because I would say the law is probably the most misunderstood branch of our system, right? The judiciary, people don't understand how law really works. And as I learned more and more about how law works, I also learned more and more about how law oppresses and disadvantages and marginalizes. And so for me, it was like, do I really want to become part of this system? Or if I'm going to continue with this path, then I need to be able to identify a way in which I can actually not be part of the problem, where I can make a difference. And at the time, the way I was able to kind of resolve that to kind of resume my journey as a law student was I decided I was going to be a judge, because I felt like, as a judge, I get to interpret the law. I get to, have my voice, my perspective, influence how I view evidence, how I view, just situations. And that was good enough to get me through law school. Because honestly, at a point I was like, I don't think I want to do this. I'm not even sure I'm going to finish, So ed law wasn't part of that because I still hadn't been exposed to it. But like I said, that being able to identify a way that I could make a difference as a lawyer allowed me to finish. And then after I clerked for a year with a judge, I was hired by the Protection and Advocacy Agency of Hawaii, which is a disability rights agency. And I was hired as their education law staff attorney, even though I knew nothing about it. But I got a crash course in ed law. And that's when I was like, yes, this makes sense to me. This feels right, and I haven't looked back.
Yeah, I'm always fascinated because you ended up at the right place for you, even though it wasn't planned out. I'm always interested in connecting the dots, how people connect the dots of their life and
Yes.
the through line, because that through line came through and met you back. And
Yes.
I mean, you talked about doing it for 26, 27 years. Who knows what else you'll be doing from that through line. So good for you. Good for you. All right. So now let's talk about you have a recent series of books, but you also have 5 books, which I'm still, again, going to say it just blows my mind. But it does suggest to me that you are very committed and you're committed to getting the work out there in lots of ways. But let's talk about, we can start with the most recent book, but you could talk about the others however you want. Okay. So the most recent one, Student Speech and Expression in Public Schools, a resource guide for K-12 schools. Tell us the premise of the book.
So the book is really to provide guidance to school administrators about speech in schools, like what's protected, what can they regulate, that sort of thing. So, and the book actually came about as I had a client who there was a complaint filed against them by the ACLU. And so as part of their settlement, the ACLU required them to create a guide for their administrators around student speech. So the basis of the claim was essentially that they had suppressed the protected speech of students inadvertently. And so they wanted a guide. And actually they weren't my client at the time, but they reached out to me to draft this guide. And so I went ahead and did that. And part of my practice is when I create things like that, it doesn't make sense to me that only this client gets it, right? Only this district gets the benefit of this guidance. And so I just took it and kind of expanded it a bit and then, said, I'm going to put this book out because again, this is information that all administrators need to understand. Some of the biggest judgments against school districts are around suppression of student speech. And so from the perspective of protecting my client, I obviously don't want them to have these huge judgments. But from the perspective of creating an environment for students, right, that is safe, that is respectful, I should say, of who they are, it's important that they understand the difference, right? And it's not easy. It's not a simple kind of area of law to understand, but there are some basic things that they should understand. And so that's really what this book is about, is to try to provide that guidance, give them some examples of student speech that would not be protected, like hate speech, speech advocating violence or drugs or something like that, versus speech that might be protected, right? And so that's really what that book does.
What's an example of speech that might be protected?
So,
that you could say.
Yeah. So for instance, here's a case that came up not that long ago that I wasn't a part of, but it's something that was in the news. So there was a student project where the kids had to make some artwork and the artwork gets posted in the hallways. Okay. And one student's artwork referenced Black Lives Matter, and the school refused to put it up because they felt that was political, it would be disruptive. So that was a problem. That was an example of student speech that actually is protected. It didn't violate the guidelines of the assignment, but they put everyone else's posters up and not the student's poster. So that would be an example.
I see. Yeah, that's an example that we can all relate to, given this day and age that we're living in right now.
Yes.
All right. So now tell us about, it's kind of clear if you've written all these books and the journey that brought you here, but tell us what lights you up the most about your work.
What lights me up the most is knowing that I make a difference for some people. It's like, and I say some in this, not some of the people that I work with, because I actually think I make a difference for all of them, but I only work with a portion, right? I only get to, train, a small fraction of all of the educators that exist in our state, right? But really, I love doing my PDs. I love going in. I love engaging with them. I love challenging them. And I love hearing at the end that they have learned more in this couple hours than they have in their 15-year career, And quite honestly, it is that feedback that got me to decide to take the time to write my first book, because I've always been training. I trained when I was in Hawaii. I was a trainer for the state. So I've always loved that engagement. But when I was in California, once I moved to California and I had been doing these trainings for, 10 years, And the feedback I would regularly get is, why are we not learning this in our administrative credential programs? Why are we learning? Like, I've been an administrator for 10 years and I never knew this. And a lot of people, it depends. You're only going to learn what the person who's teaching you knows, right? So if the person who is teaching you has a practice that really isn't consistent with the law, or, is a little questionable, you don't know that. You're going to adopt that practice. And so after, like I said, over a decade of getting this kind of feedback, I'm like, I know what the issues are. I know where they're having challenges because these are the cases that I get called about. And I also get the feedback from when I do my PD. So why don't I actually just put it down in a book? Like the things that I tell them, the things that I'm training them about, why don't I just write this down so that they can open up the book and have the answer, or at least have an idea of where to find the answer. And that was the impetus to start writing. And then it just kind of continued to evolve because I'm like, my first book was, it is the first of its kind and it was a great book. But, as time went on, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much more. There's all these tools, and so my third book, which is the first of the new series, the Student Discipline Resource Binder, I actually provided all of it, I've created hundreds of forms to help support my clients to document, to be in compliance. So I'm like, I just want to give these away. So I just put them in the book, so that a school could buy that book and they can say, hey, Dora, I bought your book. Can I have your forms? And I will send them the Word version of the forms. And I'm like, dude, yes, use them, right? I have all these tools. And so that's really kind of how the books came about. And that's kind of what drives me kind of going forward is what new information do they need? What are the things that are coming up that I can help provide tools, and how do I maybe even provide some more specific tools? Like what other groups need these tools? Like teachers, like board members, I have focused traditionally on administrators and parents, but there are other stakeholders, right, in this process that need access to that information. And so that's what I'm working on 3 books right now. 3 more books.
Wow, you'll be up to 8 when these 3 are done.
Yep, they'll be done. My goal is January 1st. They're going to be done and out. So we'll see.
That's amazing. Good for you. And I just want to mention, because you mentioned your first book, and that was Student Discipline, Special Education Discipline, Anti-Bullying, and Other Relevant Student Issues, a guide for practitioners.
Yes.
Because for people who are listening and heard you refer to that. And then that middle one, as you mentioned, was the Student Discipline Resource Binder. And so now what are the next 3? Can you tell us, give a sneak preview, or you want to wait until they come out?
Well, it depends on when this audio podcast is going to be.
Right.
No.
It's going to be January. It's going to be.
Oh, perfect. No, I can tell you then.
Okay.
Yeah. No. So basically, it's one is going to be a guide for teachers. So teachers, there is a huge misunderstanding about kind of what teachers can and can't do around student discipline and what rights they have and what obligations they have. And so I train administrators on this, but in the end, the teachers are the ones who need to know, right? And I can pretty much guarantee you that most of the administrators don't take what I've taught them, right, and get it to the teachers. And so I want to create something for teachers so that they can, have their own little guidebook that says, hey, this is what the law says, provide them citations if they want to look it up. Because the other piece to this part with teachers is when I train teachers, a lot of teachers may engage in practices that, again, are not always in the best interest of the students, right? And it's not because they're bad teachers. It's that they don't really know any better and they don't totally understand, right? And so what I want to do is just like when I train them, the feedback I get is, wow, I didn't know that. Like, for instance, they may get frustrated because a student, engages in what they consider to be inappropriate behavior. They send the student out. The student comes back and they're upset because they're like, well, why didn't they get suspended? Why didn't the administrator do this or do that? And they don't understand what the limitations are, the rules are that the administrator has to comply with, right? And they don't communicate. So from the teacher's perspective, the administrator did nothing,
Mm.
or they should have done more. And it's just the administrator being soft. And it's not that. It's like the administrator actually didn't have any other option but to do an intervention and send the student back given the circumstances. Right.
Mm.
And so, when they understand kind of the limitations that their administrators are working with, it actually makes it easier for them to accept what's going on, right? So that's part of it. And then the other part is, I have a training that I do with teachers. I do with all the stakeholders, but when I've done it with teachers, it's around creating like trauma-informed responses to discipline, and as part of that training, I give them just a brief background on adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, and the impact of trauma. And I have to tell you, when I do this, like with teachers, there's a shift in some of them that goes from, because the idea is if you believe that the student is misbehaving because they're bad, you're going to have one reaction. But if you believe that the student is misbehaving because they're hurting or they're in pain or because it's a traumatic response, right, to whatever the situation is, it shifts how they think about what their consequence should be, right? And so again, my idea, my hope is just to try to educate them, to give them information, to give them some places to look for more information to help improve their practice. So that's one of the books. I'm doing one for board members as well. And again, the idea is, you have a lot of school board members that are not educators. They're community members, they're parents, but they are not educators and they don't always understand what the law requires of them in this process. And so that book is really geared toward helping them understand their role, again, specific to the student discipline process. And then my last book is on Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, which is a disability rights law. And it's a very misunderstood law by school districts. And it's also a law that school districts have a very hard time complying with for various reasons. And so this book is really meant to, again, be a guide for them about how to comply.
All valuable. They all sound extremely valuable. It's almost like automatic that the people would be standing in line waiting for those books. But in that vein, how do you get your books out there to the districts and to the other stakeholders and readers of the book?
Yeah, honestly, it's really word of mouth. I mean, I wish I had the time to do some, real marketing of it, but it's word of mouth. So when I train, a lot of times I will encourage them to buy a copy of the book depending on the topic, just to support the learning. And then if they do that, as I train, I can actually walk the participants through how to use the book and the type of information that's in the book. And then it's like I said, it's really word of mouth. I mean, in many ways, the school community is a very kind of tight knit community. So, there are certain conferences that everybody goes to and they do their networking. And so they talk to each other. And then I also present at some conferences. And then I typically will have a vendor table and my presentation will, kind of flows into what the content of my books are. So, that's kind of how I get it out there. And yeah.
That's good. That it's a natural fit, right?
Yeah.
It's an extension of your teaching and your training. All right. So now you know that this podcast is Leadership Purpose, right? And the podcast is for what I call high achieving women. Now I'll give my definition of high achieving women. Women who are ambitious, goal oriented, professional, and they can do a few things. They're pretty good at a few things. And they're the ones that people come to at work and at home. They're the ones that people turn to when they have questions. They're just that person. And on top of all that, they've written at least one book. So I'm thinking they're the ones that typically support everyone else. So who supports them? So that's why I created the podcast. So then we could have high achieving women talk about their work, but also provide support to other high achieving women. All right. So now with that in mind, what's something from your experience professionally or personally that you'd like to contribute to this conversation to support high achieving women? Any word of advice, wisdom, thought that you have?
Sure. Two things come to mind immediately. One is just believing in yourself, just knowing like that what you have is worthwhile and having the courage to just kind of step out and do whatever it is, not waiting for somebody else to give you permission or to support you in doing it because you may be waiting a very long time. Right. So really just kind of, if you have an idea, just not being afraid to go forward and to trust that it has value. That's the important piece. And, the other thing that comes to mind, is really well, I guess I've already said it. It's the trust that it has value, right? So it's to have the courage to do it, but to trust that it has value and to believe in yourself. I mean, I feel like those are two of the most important characteristics, right? To really just share what you have, because so many women in particular, right, are amazing and they have so much to share, but our society doesn't really always value, what we have to share or the way in which we want to share it, And so I feel like, hey, just go for it and just trust. And, and here's the thing. If it doesn't work out the way you think, what's the harm? In the end, it's like you do the best you can do, and that's all anyone can do.
Yes, yes. And I'm thinking about those even who have books. And sometimes, I hear authors talk about the challenge of marketing their books because of that. So your advice speaks to that issue as well. All right. So now with the leadership purpose part, you can tell purpose is on my mind if I title the podcast Leadership Purpose. So do you think it's important to have purpose for you or for others to have a sense of purpose in their work? And if so, why? And if not, why not?
Well, for me, 100%. My purpose that drives what I do. It is what gives me the direction and the clarity. I am regularly thinking about, what am I trying to achieve here? What difference am I trying to make? And am I going about it in the right way? And the reality is that, not every audience can hear your message, the same way. And so also, so sometimes I have to adjust my message given the audience. And, and I used to struggle with that because I felt like, am I somehow compromising some part of what I'm trying to accomplish? But in the end, what I realized is that I'm still sending the same message. I'm just using, different words, less charged words. Sometimes I may be provocative. We'll see. But in the end, I am clear of what my purpose is and what my objective is. And if in the end, my audience isn't able to hear it, then, on the one hand, I can say, well, that's that. There's nothing I can do about that. But on the other hand, I'd like to be able to say that I was able to present it in a way where they could hear some of that,
Mm-hmm.
But again, I think that's where the purpose comes in because I am always very clear about what my objective is and how best to try to achieve that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes sense. It makes so much sense to me based on everything you've said so far. And it's so consistent with what you have shared with us. And you've been generous with your time. Is there anything that I didn't get a chance to ask you or a thought that comes to mind that you say, hey, I want to share this one more thing before we head off into the rest of our day?
Nothing comes to mind right off. I mean, I just, honestly, I just want to thank you for having me here. I mean, there are very few opportunities to talk about what I do. And if there's someone who can benefit from kind of hearing, my story, that's awesome. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to chat with you.
Well, you're welcome. I'm glad that we had this opportunity and that it took us a little while to juggle our schedule, but we made it. We did. Now, I'm sure I'm inspired by your story. I knew a little bit about it, but I'm inspired by hearing it on many levels. The kind of personal development from your early years to where you are now. I'm inspired by, starting your own law firm and your company and training and all the work you do and making a difference. So I can only imagine others might have that similar experience. If they want to get in touch with you, how can they get in touch with you?
The best way is just to email me. My email is dora@doradomelaw.com. And there's no assistant. It's just me. So if you email me, I'll get it. And that's the best way. And they can also check out my website, which is at www.doradomelaw.com.
Okay, we'll be sure to put that in the show notes. Dora Dome, thank you for being such a gracious guest today. So glad you were here. Thank you for being
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. It was my pleasure.
You're welcome. Okay, everyone. And if you want to, I would like to hear from you. And not even if I was going to say, do you want to? But I'd really love to hear your response to the episode. Just send me a message over on LinkedIn at Robin L. Owens, PhD. I mean, I'm on the other social media sites too, same at Robin L. Owens, PhD, but I primarily hang out on LinkedIn. And if you happen to be an author and you've been thinking about, I wonder if I could really expand the message beyond the book and create a course based on my book, but I don't know if my book really, is it ready to be turned into a course? If you're asking that question, I have the answer for you in my new checklist that you can get at my website, createmasterfulcourses.com, createmasterfulcourses.com. So head over there right now, get the checklist. You won't be disappointed. And until next time, this is Dr. Robin. Thank you for tuning into this episode of the Leadership Purpose with Dr. Robin podcast. If you enjoyed it, head on over and rate and subscribe so you never miss an episode. New episodes drop every week, and I can't wait to hang out with you again soon. Meanwhile, this is Dr. Robin signing off. See you next time.